Imagine waking up before sunrise. Not because an alarm went off, but because the cold has pierced through the hides and furs covering your body, and because there is work, there is always work, waiting outside. You don't think about routine. You think about surviving the winter, feeding your children, knowing exactly where your next meal will come from. Now imagine doing all of that without a grocery store, without a hardware shop, without a government, without any of the invisible structures that hold modern life together. And yet, despite all of this, you built a civilization so sophisticated that the Europeans who arrived in the Americas were literally at a loss for words to describe it, and then decided to ignore it. That is the central problem of understanding what Native American tribes actually did every day. The question seems simple. The answer is unsettling in its complexity. Two of the most common and most costly mistake history made was looking at these cultures and seeing absence. No alphabetic writing, no wheel, no cast iron. The list of what was missing became an argument for a narrative of primitivism that still distorts what was really happening on those plains, forests, and coastlines. But absence is not emptiness. It is choice. It is adaptation. It is, more often than not, an ingenious solution to a problem that European civilization had not yet correctly formulated. Take the most basic example possible: food. A Lakota man waking up on the Great Plains in the 15th century did not go out to hunt in the casual sense the word implies. What he did was the result of years of specialized training within a knowledge system as dense as any modern technical manual. He knew bison behavior across different seasons. He knew how the wind carried human scent and at what distance it would alert the herd. He knew that a group of 40 animals driven with precision into a specific ravine could feed an entire band for weeks, if and only if every hunter executed his role at the exact moment, in absolute silence, without error. A collective bison hunt was less like an expedition and more like a choreographed military operation, with defined roles, nonverbal communication signals, and a clear decision-making hierarchy. And when the hunt ended, the real work began. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. The meat was sliced into thin strips and sun-dried or smoked to last for months. Bones were boiled to extract marrow, a dense caloric source vital during months of scarcity. Tendons became thread for sewing and for bows. The bladder and stomach became waterproof containers for carrying water. The hide went through a tanning process that took days, softened with the animal's own brain. A technique that, ironically, works because the amount of fat in a mammal's brain is almost always sufficient to tan its own hide. This is not superstition. It is empirical biochemistry discovered through generations of observation. But here is the first break from expectation. All of this survival engineering was not carried out by a single person. It was distributed. And the way it was distributed reveals something about the social organization of these peoples that conventional historiography took far too long to recognize. If you're finding this as fascinating as we do, hit that subscribe button right now. We publish new deep dives every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The division of labor among Native American peoples did not follow the logic a 16th century European observer would have expected to find. There was no king distributing tasks. There was no market regulating supply and demand. What existed was something simultaneously simpler and harder to grasp. A web of reciprocal obligations so deeply internalized that it functioned without needing to be spoken aloud. Among the Haudenosaunee, the people the French called the Iroquois, women controlled agriculture, not helped with it, controlled it. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, were grown together in a polyculture system that modern agricultural science took centuries to fully understand. Corn grows tall and provides structural support. Beans climb the corn and fix nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing what corn depletes. Squash spreads across the ground, blocking sunlight and preventing weed growth, while its broad leaves retain moisture. The three plants sustain each other in a symbiosis that increases total yield and reduces maintenance labor. This was not discovered by accident. It was refined over centuries of deliberate experimentation, passed from mother to daughter as specialized technical knowledge. And while women managed food production, Men were not simply hunting and warring, as the simplified narrative insists. They were diplomats, infrastructure engineers, botanical medicine specialists, navigators, long-distance traders. The Hopewell Trade Network, which flourished between 100 BC and 500 AD, connected communities from the Gulf of Mexico to Lake Superior. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains appears in archaeological sites more than 3,000 kilometers away. Native copper from Lake Superior reached the Atlantic coast. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico were buried with leaders in Ohio. This is not casual exchange between neighbors. It is structured continental trade, maintained by routes, agreements, and diplomatic relationships that required years of negotiation and built trust. But all this sophistication carried a problem that made it simultaneously powerful and fragile. It was oral. There was no archive. There was no document. Knowledge lived in people, in elders who memorized genealogies spanning dozens of generations, in healers who held in memory hundreds of medicinal plants with their dosages and contraindications, in political leaders who knew by heart the terms of every alliance and every treaty ever negotiated. Among the Haudenosaunee, the wampum, belts woven with shell beads and specific patterns, functioned as mnemonic records of diplomatic agreements. Each pattern was a code that a trained speaker could read aloud, reconstructing the terms of a treaty closed decades earlier. It is not writing, but it is record. The distinction matters. The problem begins to surface when you realize the weight of this system. A civilization sustained entirely by human memory is a civilization that can be erased not by the destruction of libraries, but by the death of people. And that is exactly what happened, before most Europeans even reached the interior of the continent. Estimates vary, but archaeological and documentary data converge on a number that is still difficult to process. Between 1492 and 1600, between 50% and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was wiped out by diseases for which they had no prior immunity. In some regions, the collapse was nearly total. Entire villages disappeared, and with them disappeared knowledge accumulated over millennia, not burned in a fire, but buried alongside the last people who held it. When European colonizers pushed into the interior of the continent and found wild and uninhabited lands, what they found in many cases were the silent ruins of civilizations that had collapsed decades before their arrival. There is a scene that repeats in the accounts of the first European explorers with a disturbing consistency. They arrive in a region, find open fields interspersed with dense forests, rivers full of fish, plains covered in tall grasses and animals in absurd abundance. And they conclude, almost invariably, that they are standing before untouched nature. Virgin paradise, ownerless land. They were wrong, profoundly, consequentially wrong. What those explorers interpreted as wild nature was, in most cases, an environment actively managed through centuries of deliberate human intervention. The central technique was fire. Not accidental fire, not destructive fire, but controlled fire, applied in specific seasonal cycles with precise objectives. The peoples of the Great Plains burned vast stretches of prairie in autumn. The immediate result looked like devastation, and the medium-term result was the opposite. Burning eliminated invasive plants, returned nutrients to the soil, and stimulated the growth of young, nutritious grasses that attracted bison in far greater numbers than any unmanaged prairie could ever sustain. It was ranching without fences, herd management without domestication. On the Pacific Northwest coast, the Kalapuya people burned Oregon valleys with calendar precision to maximize the production of edible commas and bulbs. California tribes use fire to stimulate acorn production, the caloric base of much of the local diet. In the East, entire communities practiced what we would now call selective forestry, removing certain trees to open clearings, favoring fruit-bearing species, creating forest edges that multiplied habitat diversity, and consequently, hunting abundance. The ecologist Charles Mann described pre-colonial New England not as dense, impenetrable forest, but as an open park, and managed by the Wampanoag and other coastal peoples across generations. When colonizers arrived and found this environment seemingly perfect for European agriculture, they did not realize it had been prepared, inadvertently for them, by centuries of indigenous labor that the epidemic had abruptly interrupted. But environmental management was only one layer. Beneath it operated something even more invisible to European eyes, an economy radically different in its foundations. Wealth, known among most Native American peoples, did not accumulate. It redistributed. The potlatch practiced by Northwest Coast peoples like the Kwakwaka'wakw and the Haida was a ceremony in which a leader demonstrated status and power, not by what they owned, but by how much they could give away. A chief who distributed blankets, food, and objects of value to hundreds of guests left the potlatch with almost nothing, and with a reputation no accumulation could buy. Generosity was the currency. Yes, redistribution was the bank. The Canadian colonial governments banned the potlatch in 1885, making it a crime punishable by imprisonment. The official justification was that the practice was savage and incompatible with the values of economic progress. The real justification, read between the lines of documents from the era, key was more direct. An economy founded on radical redistribution was structurally incompatible with the accumulation of private property that the colonial system needed to establish in order to function. It was not the potlatch that needed to be destroyed. It was the logic it represented. And here lies the hardest knot to untangle. How much of that knowledge, fire management, the Three Sisters agronomy, trade networks, diplomatic systems, botanical medicine, survived the demographic collapse? The active prohibition and the systematic silence that followed? The answer is uncomfortable. Much survived, but fragmented, dispersed, sometimes preserved only in the field notes of 19th century anthropologists who arrived too late to see the whole system functioning. There is a detail most people do not know about the United States Constitution. When the Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to build a republican system of government for a continental-scale nation, they had few functional models to consult. Ancient Greece had been fragmented into tiny city-states. Rome had collapsed under the weight of its own empire. Europe offered monarchies, not republics. What existed just a few hundred kilometers away was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a political alliance between 6 distinct nations with a system of government based on consensus, separation of powers, and an explicit protection of individual rights that had been functioning for at least 3 centuries. Benjamin Franklin had spent years negotiating with Haudenosaunee delegates. He knew the system. He cited it explicitly in correspondence as a model of what a confederation of colonies could become. This does not mean the American Constitution was copied from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and it means something more unsettling, that one of the most durable political structures in human history was being built partially on ideas developed by a people who, simultaneously, were being dispossessed, displaced, and destroyed by the very state those ideas were helping to found. The daily life of Native American peoples, and this is what the original question always points toward, even when it doesn't know it, was not a routine of primitive subsistence punctuated by incomprehensible rituals. It was the continuous operation of complex systems, agricultural systems, diplomatic systems, environmental management systems, knowledge transmission systems, economic systems with their own coherent logics. Every morning that an Ojibwe man went out to fish the Great Lakes, he carried with him a mental map of currents, depths, spawning seasons, anchoring and capture techniques accumulated over generations. Every time a Cherokee woman prepared medicine for her community, she was operating within a botanical pharmacopoeia with hundreds of active compounds, many of which Western medicine would only formally identify in the 20th century. The real limit of this system, its climax, the point where all the ingenuity Meta Wallet could not cross, was not technological, not military. It was biological and then political. The demographic collapse of the epidemics destroyed the human infrastructure that sustained the knowledge. And when survivors tried to reconstitute what remained, they found a colonial apparatus actively committed to preventing reconstruction. The forced residential schools, which operated in Canada until 1996 and in the United States until the mid-20th century, were the institutional formalization of that impediment. Children torn from their families, forbidden from speaking their languages, are punished for practicing their traditions, This was not assimilation. It was deliberate interruption of the oral transmission chain that kept the systems alive. And yet, today Lakota communities are rebuilding controlled fire prairie management practices in partnership with ecologists who have finally acknowledged what the data shows. The ecosystems of the Great Plains function better under the burning regime these peoples developed. Agronomists study the Three Sisters as a model for sustainable large-scale polycultures. Linguists and tribal members work together to document and revitalize languages that had dozens of native speakers remaining. The botanical knowledge of indigenous healers is being systematically mapped by pharmaceutical researchers who realize, belatedly, that the pharmacopoeia of the American forests is an archive of empirical discoveries of incalculable value. What Native American peoples did every day was not simple. It was the operation of an entire civilization. Distributed, oral, ecological, diplomatically sophisticated, functioning without the scaffolding we take as synonymous with complexity. The legacy of this is not buried, it is fragmented, resilient, and in surprising places, still in motion. Their story did not end. It was interrupted, and interruptions, unlike endings, always leave something unfinished. If this history moved you the way it moves us, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who thinks they already know American history. They don't. Not yet.